Good evening, everybody. Welcome to yet another Saving Elephants live stream panel discussion. This one, July the 6th, 2005, America, 249 years old. Might have been more appropriate to do this on July the 4th, but of course, July the 6th is when the Declaration of Independence was official, was promulgated, was made available. So we might as well call this America's official birthday. We are 1 year away from the grand 250-year tradition, and I think as many people seem to be doing these days, it's time to start reflecting on this. What does it mean? What is the run up for the 250th anniversary of the United States? And here to help me with that is yet another great group of panelists. Jeffrey Tyler Sick, or Tyler, political science professor of the University of Pikeville. You've been on the panel before. You've been on my podcast before. It's good to have you here. I know foundational ideas in the American founding is your jam. You have a slightly different conservative variant of, I'll say, the Peter Varick humanist conservatism, but you're within the broad tent of who I would call reasonable conservatives. I love having a conversation with. It's always good to talk to you, and thank you for hanging out with us here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to whatever extent you represent America's past, I'm going to kick it over to Laura Forkham, I think, would represent the present, because she is the president of the Independence Center, trying to grapple with what on earth is going on in this present moment with American politics, and what is up with this insurgence, if you will, of the independent voter, those who do not affiliate, or at least don't strongly affiliate, with either the Democratic or Republican Party. How do we give voice to them? What is it they want? What are they all about? Laura, thank you for coming on the panel tonight.
Thank you for having me, Josh.
And as it says there in his tagline, Eric Cohn, CEO of America's Future, is obviously representing the future of the United States here. Erica, you've been on this panel more than anyone else, I think, but it has been a while. And the most recent panel you were on was when we had having the discussion across the political divide, if you will, and you kind of acquiesced, yeah, I'll come on for this sort of a discussion. Otherwise, I'm just sick of this and this political talk. And because you used to be at the Acton Institute, and you kind of remind me of Michael Corleone. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. You can't seem to get away from Conservatism Inc. But I think you'll do great in this America's Future new capacity, very new, couple of weeks now. Great to have you with us.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I'll read that as just as deep as the Godfather analogy that you made, and not as an indication of how this is all going to end for me, because sometimes that feels a little more accurate on given the day.
Are you referring to the quality of the third movie or the actual storyline of Michael Corleone's life?
Column A, column B.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, please don't read into that any more than that was intended. As I would remind everyone, this is a live stream for everyone watching. Please feel free to ask, to type in questions. I would love to have a chance to get the panels to interact with our audience. Providing they're appropriate questions, I will gladly share them here on the screen. I'm going to leave this conversation rather open-ended, because I think it calls for reflection, I think. But I want to start here because the general conversation is around America at 249 years old. How do we start off? We are, as people often say, a nation of an idea, or ideas, right? We're unique in that sense. So I think it's good that we, as Americans, occasionally reflect, okay, what are those ideas? How have they evolved? How are we living up to them? And then where do we see this going in the future? Are we heading in the right direction, or fundamentally heading off course? And so I think the most obvious place to begin with is, and I'll open this up to anyone, what do you think is the basic idea of America? Do you agree with that premise, America is idea? And if so, what is the idea?
Everyone talks at once.
You got to pick on somebody for that one, Josh.
I think we should start.
Someone else can start too.
I'll kick it over to, and it occurred to me, it may be too broad a question, so I'll just, but yeah, I'm going to leave it broad. Tyler, what do you say? What would you think is a fundamental idea or ideas of America?
I mean, I think that the short answer is something like liberty and equality. This seems to be kind of the common theme in the founding documents. But I tend to think Lincoln kind of really captures it best in the Gettysburg Address. He says, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It seems like the purpose is something like the foundation is something like human equality. And what that means, I think, is that's a big thing to unpack. What does it mean that all people are equal? Because it could mean we're all exactly the same. That seems, I think, evidently not true. So it means something much more complex than that. I think legal equality is certainly part of it. But Thomas Jefferson said, and I think this is Thomas Jefferson thought, and I think he if you're going to go and find who understands the foundation of America, Thomas Jefferson's not a bad person to go to. That we're all equal in that nobody is actually born to rule. We're all equal in our capacity to rule at birth. And at some point, some of us may develop skills that make us better politicians or so on. But at least at the beginning, we're all born with the same capacity for rulership. No, there are no natural kings. And that's a really good, that's actually a radical foundation for government. It sounds really boring and trite now, but it was a huge deal back then. And it's still kind of a huge deal, I think, if you follow it to its conclusions.
So I introduced you, of course, as a humanist conservative, but your response sounds like you're channeling Harry Jaffa there, right? Reaching right for Lincoln and the Declaration and how Jefferson got this right. Although, in all fairness, Jefferson got a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong. And at least the Declaration is one of those I can applaud the guy on. But I like how you close there, because that is true. This is a radical idea. It's one that is not shared by all humans, certainly not shared by all humans in the past, and was relatively new.
Well, I have to take up for Lincoln because I'm Jefferson because I'm a UVA graduate. I'm obligated. He's on my diploma. I mean, his face, they literally put his face on your diploma. So
fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I guess I won't goad the panelist into any potential criticisms of Jefferson. We'll save that for a future podcast. But what say you, Laura or Eric?
That was my list as well: liberty and equality. And I think we're still unpacking what that means. And that was what I came here to say is if we're talking about foundational ideas and how we've lived up to them, what are the institutions that keep us on track for living up to those things, and how have they evolved over time, and where do we see them going? So I co-sign Tyler's very concise list.
At the danger of finding out if, now that you've referenced Jaffa, if Tyler is like Jaffa, and if you find it hard disagreeing with him, try agreeing with him. I shall test that here. No, I think I largely agree with that as a good definition. I mean, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and of course, the pursuit part of that being so key. There is no guarantee of happiness. There is the opportunity for you to find it and to define it for yourself, which was again a radical notion. I think the question, as I recall you asking it, is more about not what is the idea of America, but is America an idea, which is, I think, one of the interesting things that, rewind 15 to 20 years in conservative, intra-political right debates wouldn't have been a terribly controversial statement, right? That America is an idea. It has become a more controversial statement as people have attempted to, by my lights, interpolate different elements of European conservatism, which has a completely different foundation and a context to it than conservatism in an American context. And you can go just back to Hayek's Why I Am Not a Conservative essay, where he's pretty explicit in that I'm not talking about American conservatives because they're the heirs of a radical liberal revolution. He's talking about the blood and soil, throne and altar kind of people, which is, as with an eye towards America's future, one of the things that I'm protective of is recognizing that America is a place, it is a people. It is not a nation state in the same way that almost every other nation state around the world is, in that, the example that is often given that you can go live in all kinds of different places. You may be able to even become a citizen in a lot of these countries, but 50 years after being born in, St. Louis, Missouri, going and living in France for 50 years, you'll never be French. Really, before you even become a citizen, in many ways, you can become an American, because it is about more than just being from a place or being in a place. It is about being of a way of viewing the world and viewing how we should govern ourselves. I think that is something incredibly important, and has been pointed out here a couple of times, incredibly radical and a huge, big deal in the history of humanity. So I think we have this tendency too much to want to dismiss, I think partly because, like so many other revolutions, or unlike so many other revolutions around the world, The American Revolution did not go pear-shaped really fast and turn into something terrible. So I think it loses a little bit of the luster, especially for some sets of academics who like to break apart, what in the French Revolution was so incredibly important that it ended up in guillotines, or what in the Russian Revolution was so incredibly important that it ended up in the way that it did. The way that we can be so ho-hum about America is because it worked out so incredibly well that we lose the radical context of what was being done at the time.
I appreciate you saying that, Eric. I intentionally did not invite any nationalists to the panel discussion. I have friends who are nationalists. I have no problem with having them on for a panel discussion, but that would be a very different discussion than the one I'm hoping to have tonight, which presumably we all defend the basic notion America is an idea, or at least not at the expense of its, we say it's such a nation state to the point that to call it an idea is almost meaningless. That being said, I think it's also important to kind of focus on, okay, if we're loosely in agreement with it is an idea, and maybe we're loosely in agreement with liberty and equality being those central ideas, this is my belief, and I'll pass around and see what you guys think. I think one can stand in danger of either holding those ideas too loosely or too tightly. And what I mean by that is I think one of the tensions within the idea, I think, give this nation a lot of vitality, a lot of strength, because there is a manner in which you can call liberty and equality things that find their homes in both the conservative right, but also the progressive left. There are some radical traditions where they don't fit, hardcore socialist or certainly a Marxist ideology, some of the more national populist extremist or monarchist, if you will. But for the most part, most Americans that largely can be mapped in the broader left and right can all equally say they ascribe to liberty and equality as fundamental principles we're all fighting for. As Tyler mentioned, though, that doesn't mean we agree what those things mean. And so I'm just curious there, because to me, I think there's a necessary tension that the vitality of the United States is necessary, that we, this is a decidedly conservative podcast, and I decidedly have a conservative view of what liberty and what equality means. But I recognize that perhaps in a nation of 330 million people, it may be necessary that I would allow for a broader definition of that in order to see my fellow friends on the left and consider them just as much an American as I am. That being said, I also think they're wrong. And I think their definition of liberty and equality is potentially destructive. So I want to be able to have arguments with them, and I ultimately want to defeat their ideas. But I need to be in a frame of mind in the democratic process that sometimes their ideas might win out over mine. I may have to recognize I've been defeated at the ballot box or even in the arena of ideas. So what do you guys think about that general notion about liberty and equality being a concept that we could either be too tight or too loose with?
What I would quibble maybe with one thing that I think it's been a while since I've had a conversation with a card-carrying Marxist. It has been at least 5 years since I've lived in the city of Chicago, so it's been at least that long. But I would say they would probably, if I recall, would say that they believe in liberty and equality, just with very different definitions of what those things are.
French radicals believe in liberty and equality.
Right. So this becomes a contest where we have to define what we actually mean by our terms. And liberty and equality in the American tradition, or at least in the American political tradition, do often have these Rorschach test qualities to them, where people love using the terms because, again, of how it just inculcated into our DNA as Americans, those things are. They are, bells that we begin to salivate the minute that we start hearing them. But what we mean by them is incredibly important. And again, by my definition of it, the equality part especially is the equality of opportunity, that we try to do our best to give people the same set of opportunities to make something with their lives. And really, I think that is the biggest story of at least modern political life, has been grappling with what actually is equality and what do we need to do for people who have been historically disadvantaged. The argument for something like affirmative action has a lot more weight at the time that it is, that it comes about, than it does perhaps in modern America. But I think we're always chafing against the definitions that people have of liberty. I mean, I as you mentioned, I was at the Acton Institute for a number of years, and Lord Acton would describe liberty as, not the license to do whatever you want, but the freedom to choose what you ought. And there is a definition of liberty that is shared by both the radical left and at times my, libertarian friends, and I'll disclose that I do have, sometimes consider myself a libertarian, that it is somewhere between libertinism and licentiousness. These in very micro ways, we can define those things for ourselves. But what we want to try to engage in as a broader political project is to have a very base and encompassing definition of those things that creates the space for people to live in ways that we may not personally like, but that we permit them to do so because it is the most peaceful way to live amongst each other.
I think there's even sort of baked into some of the things Eric is saying, in the kind of broad liberal tradition, by which I mean, like the American founders and most Americans, actually, to the history of America, in some way or the other. I think there's a kind of like epistemic humility that like we may think we know what liberty and equality mean. We can never know with 100% certainty what liberty and equality mean, and thus it's wrong for the government to just go ahead and define the terms. There's kind of baked into the system something like pluralism and this idea that we're going to debate what these mean for the rest of the country's history. And that's actually, I think, another part of the radicalism of America, though. It's founded on ideas, and it doesn't define the ideas entirely for you. I think there's really good arguments against some interpretations of those ideas, but the founders disagreed on what some of those things meant. Hamilton and Jefferson famously have radically different ideas about what liberty and equality mean.
They had several rap battles about it.
Yes. Maybe we can call it radical humility, because I think what they set up was a system of norms and institutions that allowed for us to continue to find the truth of what we mean by those things. And the definitions changed tremendously over the past 49 years of our country's founding, and probably in ways that the founding fathers wouldn't have envisioned if we're talking about marriage equality, right? And so I often kind of engage in the thought experiment of what will the things that we're doing right now be, right? Like, what are the things we're doing right now that 200 years from now, it will be somebody else's 13-year-old going, I can't believe people ever thought that was okay. That's one of my favorite things to ask. Like, what is the thing that you think we're misunderstanding in this very moment when it comes to defining liberty and equality that's going to seem way off base in the future?
There's a great Gordon Wood quote, and I don't have it memorized, so I'm just going to paraphrase it. But it's something like, don't judge people for the illusions of their time period, because we have illusions too. We just don't know what ours are yet. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, to kind of look at history and politics with real humility.
I think that is a fundamentally conservative idea, and you don't have to be conservative. C.S. Lewis, for instance, coined the term, I think it was him that coined it, chronological snobbery. The idea that everything that came before us is just sort of Neanderthals, and so therefore we don't have to pay attention to them. And he had made an interesting point, not only intellectually, but even from moral frameworks, that things that we find repugnant today, we can look back and I think even certainly from a Christian lens, look at, whoa, but yeah, in the past, they were doing some virtuous things that they would find, be aghast at the way we're behaving. And he equated it to, in the eyes of our Creator, in the eyes of God, how equal we must look in this regard, how there's no one generation or one human or society that just stands head and shoulders above the rest. And therefore that vitality, that ability to never fully answer the question, if you will, to open that process to inquiry and debate. It doesn't mean you're going to get at the right answer, but it certainly seems that you have a better shot at it than those societies that organize in such a way that they're just a central figure, say, we have found the answer for all time, and we're just going to impose this on people.
There's a really great book along the lines of this conversation that I want to recommend called But What If We're Wrong, by a guy named Chuck Klosterman, who is, I don't know, maybe for lack of a better way to describe him, a pop culture philosopher. He's a really great essayist. And if you're a listener to the Bill Simmons podcast, you've heard him on there talking about the NBA before. But the premise of this book is to try to get us to look at the present the way that we look at the past. and
Mm.
to try to, I think, disabuse us of a lot of that chronological snobbery where, we look back at people, oh, people thought that, the earth was the center of the universe. How silly are they? And at the same time are completely confident that everything that they believe at this very moment in time is completely correct and will be venerated not just 250 years into the future, but thousands of years into the future beyond what we possibly can conceive of. And it is, I think, a very helpful exercise to be able to try to look at the present with that kind of humility and recognizing that, things people were absolutely certain of at the time, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, were very wrong about, but that doesn't make them bad people. It doesn't make them stupid or uneducated. It made them wrong about some things, and we will be wrong about things that we cannot possibly possibly conceive of at this point in time. But I think it is a book that I've returned to actually a number of times for trying to think in that way.
It's a great book. I also return to it. It's a really helpful perspective shift.
I've not heard of that book. I will have to. Thanks for the recommendation. I'll have to give it a look. I want to ask. I'm kind of the opinion that for the most part, I would hope most Americans view this country sort of the way a fully formed adult views their parents. In other words, when we're children, our parents are godlike. The founding fathers were all perfect, never disagreed on anything. Everything the United States has ever done is wonderful. And then when you're a teen, they're just awful. They've never done anything right. And hopefully when you become a parent, presuming you have, non-abusive good parents, that is, you would have a sense of, okay, they're human. They make mistakes, but you can still honor them. You can still admire them. You can still genuinely be grateful for what they've done. And you can still recognize, wow, my parents, I'm grateful I had my parents versus the parents I see down the street who are genuinely abusive. And I would say if as children, we have really good parents, if I'm straining this analogy probably a little too much as far as the nation goes. So that being said, my general view is that the United States has done a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong. Generally speaking, I'm incredibly grateful for it. I think it's an exceptional nation. We should be proud to live here. And I can riff off that a little bit, and I welcome your thoughts there. But where I'm going with this is I'm wondering, do we have an overpopulation of American teenagers in this present moment? Is there a general sense in the United States of more people who say in America is all wrong? Or has it always been this way? Certainly from political dividedness, obviously. Sometimes there are variants of the left, and sometimes the right too, to be fair, but certainly the left, that seem to take it sort of America's wrong all the way down, right? Just all the way through. Heck, now that I think about it, I guess that's sort of the point of the Patrick Deneen, right? We got it wrong from the start. We should start over from the original founding ideas. Is it my imagination that general sentiment is on the rise? And if not, where does that come from? Is that something that is always going to be here with us, or is that something that has festered and getting worse these days?
I mean, I've taught at two different institutions, the University of Virginia and the University of Pikeville, which is a small liberal arts college in Appalachia. Two very different populations of students. The UVA students, who I think you would more expect to be kind of anti-America, were definitely not. I think, in fact, many of my more progressive and liberal students were happy to engage with the founding and happy to use it for their own purposes, so to speak. In Appalachia, actually, I see many more students who are kind of not anti-America, but who feel, I think, very cynical about politics, who feel really like this system has broken in some way. And I don't know if they blame the founders, but it's broken in some way. And there's really no place in politics for an average American to have a voice or a say of any kind. And I find that in many ways much more depressing. And it's in part an economic thing. The UVA students are much wealthier. They mostly came from urban areas. The students here are mostly very rural. They come from a lower economic background. But I don't see as often the sort of instinctive anti-Americanism you're kind of describing. I have encountered it, but usually among faculty more than students.
Well, I guess I think part of this is the social media problem, which, as Christine Rosen at AEI has pointed out, that social media has all of the worst qualities of living in a very small town with none of the best qualities of living in a very small town. Everybody is in your business and everybody knows everything about you, but there isn't that, like, yeah, they may be a little gossipy about it, but because they know that, like, you know, when somebody dies, they're going to bring you, you know, a potluck dinner or something like that. I really tend to think that most of the people who have those kinds of conversations, that are the most down on the future of this country and on the young people who are going to make up the future of this country, are getting way too much of their information by people who over-index for being, you know, on TikTok, on other social media applications, which is just not representative of the vast majority of people in this country. I have found this really handy hack that I have for figuring out if something has kind of broken through the social media consciousness, which is, my wife is not on Twitter. And if she's aware of something that goes on that app, then I know it has broken the blood-brain barrier into reality. But most things that happen on there are like, I have to spend 5 minutes explaining like what the hell is going on for her to even just kind of go, I still don't get it. And that's actually like, in the same way that I'm a little bit envious of the people who on election day were Googling who is running for president, I'm envious of that, right? Like, there's a part of me that kind of wants to live that way, but I have my concerns about the future of the country. I mean, if I didn't, I probably wouldn't be working for an organization that's somewhat singularly dedicated to the furtherance of the American ideals into the future of this country. But I also just do not think that it is as bad as it is made out to be, and that the people who argue for that more often than not are the kind of people who, if they lost their Twitter accounts, would die of embarrassment. So I tend not to take them all that seriously in those pronouncements.
I'll say at the Independent Center, we spend a lot of time doing one-on-one interviews and focus groups and polling, and actually asking people what they think about American politics, what they think. A lot of times we've talked about, what do you think about the American dream? And I'm constantly surprised by how thoughtful and nuanced their takes are, even when they're critical. And one of the things that I've found in conversations around July 4th this year with just other people in the space is that, you know, you can be deeply critical, but yet compassionate and constructive and hopeful. And I hear so much more of that than I hear just, straight negativity, despair, right? Like the constructiveness, even when it's extremely far-reaching criticism with really serious implications, is still on the whole meant constructively. And so I find that really hopeful. The people who are just entirely negative about America are not people I'm encountering in my conversations either.
Maybe there's one of those people hanging out in Chicago that Eric used to know.
Maybe that's it.
Well, there's one other thing Tyler said that I thought was interesting, that the students that he has feeling kind of alienated from the political process, which I find fascinating, and I would say I have a theory about it. But, you know, we live in a time, again, with the social media phenomenon, of the democratization of everything. I mean, people have a voice in a way that they didn't before. And I would hazard a guess that the sense of alienation that they feel, that I think he's describing there, comes more from, and this is one of the reasons that I'm opposed to the kind of new nationalist project on the right, which is the nationalization of our politics. That is like the ability to be able to feel that you're influencing things that are going on at the federal government. Understandably, is, you know, you have one vote out of a country of 330 some million people that is absolutely enormous. And because we have gotten so far away from the kind of Tip O'Neill idea of all politics being local, it is not local anymore. It is national. It is in our departure from the vision that the founders had for this country and the way that it was supposed to operate, that we have now moved the locus of tension to Washington, D.C., where it's, you know, this is, to me, a problem that we have created by getting away from the federalist system, from being a nation of sovereign states that came together to form a nation, but that the most important thing is what's happening at your very local level. And people are far more concerned, I mean, in many cases, with far more concerned about what is going on in Israel and Gaza, not that that's not important, than they are about what their local city council may be doing. I don't know how you make that sexy again. I don't know how you get people interested in your local city council in that kind of way, but like, you actually can know those people. Like, you can see them at the grocery store. I've run into my alderman. I actually, funnily enough, would run into my now former congressman. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I live not too far from where Peter Meyer lives, but that is uncommon that people would see their member of Congress like that. We should have more members of Congress, and we should have smaller districts, and we should be able to see them more often. We'll save that for maybe a later rant. But I wonder, Tyler, in your experience, is it because of the hyper focus that we have on the national level, that's where everything is happening, that people feel more alienated from it?
So I think, yeah. So I think I have two answers, and one is yes, and then the other one is I think there's something else going on too. But the systemic problem is the nationalism. Democracy is meant to be participatory. If it's not, when the ancients invented democracy, that was the idea. And if it's not participatory, it's not particularly democratic. National government in a country the size of the United States, just by its nature, can never be that participatory. And the founders understood that, which is why they placed a lot of the issues that people care a whole lot in their daily lives kind of at the more local level. And so I think part of it is we need to make things like zoning sexy again. But I also think there are just some issues that people care a lot about that are now sort of handed up the chain that could probably be brought back down. Some of them are social issues, which get really, really complex. We don't necessarily, but other things like what can we do with the local environment around me, but we're not having any say over that, or and so on. And then also, but zoning is a big part of that too. Like, are we going to build a Walmart here? That's actually up to us. It should be up to us, and you should participate in that decision. I think the second part of the alienation, I think, is the economy. And there's not a lot. So that's not a systemic issue. It's a kind of ephemeral one. The economy is not great right now in a lot of parts of the country. Wages are stagnant. Inflation's going up. And a lot of young people in particular are not able to buy a home. They're getting these nice degrees, and then they're getting jobs they're told are nice. And the wages they have from these jobs don't really do very much for them. They're still living rent. They can barely afford. They can't start a family. So on. So I think that second part contributes to this. I think it's kind of a combination of those two separate things, pounding one another.
I like to thank Tyler for giving me an idea for a new Substack that I'm going to call Hot, Sexy, and Unzoned.
I think that's a different platform.
Yes. Find me on Only Federalism.
Yeah.
There you go. Good luck with that one. I agree, Tyler. And I think one of the things we've done too is created a norm where it seems like you're participating in democracy by commentating on federal politics and being informed, which is almost definitionally being outraged. And that's not democracy. That's not participation. I was just thinking when you guys were describing what's available for participation, I live in a really small town. The other weekend, we all went out and cleaned up the town, 140 people. I spread mulch. And what I told my kids was like, this is how the town works. This is how you make a town that you want to live in. And that's what's available to participate in. And, speculating on the intentions or meaning of people in Washington is very entertaining. I'll be the first to admit, but it's not democracy. It's not self-government.
Like Laura said there, that that sense of participation, I think we've also failed in a way in our civic education, where we have told multiple generations of people that your vote is the entry into your civic engagement. Yeah. When really, to me, it is the conclusion of your civic engagement. I probably went about a decade without voting. And I was always amazed at the way that there was a certain subset of people who would get furious at me for not voting. And I always understood it on one level of like, you have this incredible privilege that so many people fought and died for, and you don't exercise it. I'm like, yes, my choice to not exercise it is also a choice in the process. But to me, my answer was always, I worked at places like Foundation for Economic Education and the Illinois Policy Institute and the Acton Institute. Like I've always felt that I've done more to advance my civic view of this country before lunch than the culmination of just about everybody on election day. And I think we have done a very poor job of teaching people that voting is important, but it really is kind of the culmination of your engagement with the civic process. It is not the entry point of it. And it is also not the end all and be all of it.
I think that is a running theme here at Saving Elephants, Eric. And I just want to encourage the listeners that I would go further. You don't have to be a part of a political organization to engage civically. Spreading mulch, Laura, in your town is engaging civically. And I would go further than that. Being a decent person, being a law-abiding citizen, being someone who raises your children well, who respects the norms and customs, does a lot more than who you happen to vote for on election day. Every single one of us can participate civically in that manner.
I mean, I'm really lucky. One of the really fortunate things about my job is I get to talk to a lot of high school students about civics in Central Appalachia. And I often begin with, voting is probably the least we ask of you, but how often in your life have you been told just to do the bare minimum? There are many, many more things. And as Eric really points out, you don't have to vote to even be a good citizen in some ways. But I don't even go there with high schoolers. You can only, you have to begin somewhere. I choose my battles and move on.
So I want to ask about, I'm trying to think of how to frame this, because I am of the opinion that what we have here in the United States is kind of special, but that it's not guaranteed. The famous Reagan quote that freedom is never more than one generation. I'm butchering it, but there's never more than one generation away of being taken from us. I think that's probably true, although generations don't work as cookie cutter. I think sometimes we think of them. So sometimes I think there tends to be more of a slide out or into something. That being said, we kind of began this, or maybe it was my fault, with a Harry Jaffa, channeling some of that. Jaffa, in his book, Crisis of the House Divided, talked a lot about how the founders genuinely feared Caesar, Napoleon. Napoleon was more their contemporary after the founding, but that how do republics end? They tend to end by these central figures who show up, maybe save the day in some fashion, and then don't leave. And there's nothing, in my view, in our DNA as Americans that makes us completely immune from that. Now, granted, we have history and culture and a lot of institutions that work in a way that work against that. And I think there's a good deal of my friends on the left who, oftentimes in this moment, you talk to them, they I don't know if they genuinely believe it, but they certainly say we live in some sort of fascist dictatorship at this present moment. I don't think any of the three of you believe that, but I also don't think any of the three of you are of the opinion that this just goes on forever if we don't, fiercely guard our liberties. So I guess I'm wondering, we're almost 250 years old, 250 years from now, what are the prospects of this going on? What is the... I don't want to make too big a deal of it, but it's the monkey in the room I should probably bring up. January 11th, or 6th. Now I'm blanking. Is it 6th?
It's the 6th, yes.
It's the 6th.
Yeah.
January 11th is another date that's important for personal reasons. I'm getting those conflated. Not nearly as tragic. January the 6th event. And as I often say, that was a single day. It was more the lead up to that, the entire questioning of the legitimacy of the election. And I'm not trying to do a both sidesism, but quite frankly, the Democratic Party has done similar things when George W. Bush was elected, claiming that was, Bush was the commander and thief, as they called him. I think our nation is capable of large groups of people suggesting that this is illegitimate. What is the actual risk that at some point in the near or distant future, we do succumb to that sort of Caesarism that truly topples a republic?
I mean, I think I just finished, and it was a weird book to be reading around the 4th of July. But I just finished Tom Holland's history on the fall of the Roman Republic, which is a really fantastic book. If you've not read it, I recommend it. And the sort of really sobering and terrifying thing is the thing that the Romans most prided themselves on when they were a republic was their love of freedom. And then the Roman people very kind of willingly give it away at the end for any number of reasons. But I think that's kind of the story of how most free governments end. It's always at least half willing on the part of the voters. And there's usually a variety of reasons. They tend to be economic, they tend to be cultural, they tend to be political. But yeah, I mean, I think Reagan's right. Freedom is at any moment pretty close to extinction. It probably goes extinct one day, to be a really sad kind of historian. You just got to do your best to keep it going as long as you can. And at some point, it gets harder to save than it is to destroy, I think. I teach some Roman history here. And I told my students, I said, was Cicero a failure? And I thought one said, and I thought this was really smart. He's like, yeah, but he had a harder job than Caesar. He had to save the republic, and it was half dead. And Caesar had to finish it off. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I don't know where we are in that time frame. I think it's really hard to judge those things. John Quincy Adams thought when he lost his reelection that he had been defeated by the American Caesar, and it was all over. So I mean, it's hard. A lot of people. It's not just John Quincy Adams. So, I mean, I think it's hard to judge in a moment, for sure.
And I will, and I obviously I want to hear Eric and Laura your thoughts on this also, but I would be remiss if I didn't add, I do take Robert Nisbet's idea serious that nation states don't necessarily work the way as living organisms we might think. And I think sometimes there can be this necessary cynicism. You know, the very famous quote about hard times make strong men make good times make weak men make hard times. The sort of notion that we're just constantly in this revolving, no matter how hard we try, eventually we're going to all fail. And I do think, again, from a Christian perspective, yeah, eventually all human institutions fail. But I think nations can be renewed. I think we don't have to think of them as we had some high point and it necessarily is going to be going downhill from here. At the same time, I don't think it's a given that we're going to maintain status or that we could improve. We may very well be past the point of no return if we're not careful. But yeah, I just want to get that out there that I'm neither pessimist or optimist about the future. I'm hopeful.
When I was looking at some notes for this conversation, the first thing that came to mind was, and I'm showing you that I'm not a political theorist. It was Wendell Berry's essay on marriage and poetry. It's called something about old forms, fidelity. Anyway, marriage. It's about marriage and poetry, and that was the first thing that came to mind because what I think about is, do we want our institutions to tell us the truth, or do we want them to tell us what we want to hear? And right now, I think we've created a political culture where they tell us what we want to hear, and that is a very polarized, partisan truth. But it's not the actual truth of what we're doing as a country and how well we're holding up to our ideals. And so I actually skimmed the chapter again. It's very highlighted because every time I read it, I see something else that I've missed. But, you know, this idea that it's good to know the truth, and that's one of the lines in this piece, I think is really important. And that's the thing that worries me for our future as a country is our ability to hear truths that are unpleasant about our behavior as individuals and as communities and as a nation, and whether it's upholding the values that we've set up. And so I was thinking when you first posed this question, you know, I thought about this piece because I was thinking like, well, you know, we don't have to be perfect to be doing something good and important. We need to stay in the relationship and keep trying, which is really the whole theme of this piece is the Wendell Berry piece. This is a relationship and we fail it, but we continue at it. So I do have some concerns about things that look less positive, but I also think that it doesn't it doesn't make me think any worse of the endeavor that we're engaged in right now.
I think that's really insightful, and it made me think. And I think in some ways, democracy and free government ends when we give up on the struggle. In some ways, at some point, I mean, I think that is kind of what happened in ancient Rome. At some point, they get so exhausted trying to keep their system together, they just give up. And so we have to, democracy, free government, whatever you want to call it, asks a lot of us, like a good marriage or any good relationship. And we have to be willing to fulfill that. We have to be willing to listen to hard truths. We have to be willing to sacrifice our time and our energy. And when we stop being willing to do those things, I mean, that's when it ends, which is one of the reasons civics education and local democracy and all these things are so important, because they engage you in that.
Yeah, Irving Kristol had made the comment that our founders had the view a democratic government or a republic is a hard thing to keep. Unfortunately, I think because it's gone for so long, I think some of us, sometimes I'm guilty of this myself, just have this innate view that it's actually kind of easy. And if things aren't going right, it must be somebody out there doing something wrong. But no, it does require sacrifice on our part.
Yeah, I am only human, and as such, will vacillate between, being in my best, most positive mind about the endurance of the American experiment, and also seeing the dark cloud amongst the silver linings that exist out there. I can't remember, it was a few years ago who I heard say this. It was kind of stuck in my mind that it's not as bad as you fear, but it's worse than you think. And I think that, to me, describes a lot of the discourse that I see about the country, particularly, is viewed through the lens of national politics at this point in time. There's that online joke about, every time somebody references Harry Potter, that somebody says, read a different book. I would love if people would pick up, just any book about American history and really started to wrap their minds around just how bonkers American history has been. For all of the people caterwauling about, the living under a fascist government right now or things like that. Again, I am like you, Josh, and I won't speak for anybody else on the panel because I don't know. Of an age where I remember the Nazi dictator George W. Bush.
Yeah,
I've been through this experience before, where people are making these analogies, and I guess if I were to make the one,
it was truer when Woodrow Wilson was president, though.
Well, that is again part of my point, is that all the things that people said about George W. Bush were true in spades of Woodrow Wilson, and people have really no concept of that. And if I were to recommend a book for the different book for them to read, it would be anything about anything that happened prior to the Second World War, because we have the Second World War is lodged in our memories and in our creative minds for very good reasons, but also very bad reasons. And it becomes this only reference point that we have, to the point where you can only analogize things to Nazi Germany. And it's like, I don't know, man, is Trump like, is he more like Franco, or is he more like, some South American, South American strongman? But people don't know anything about any of those things. So they only go to the one analogy that they have. They only have a hammer, so everything that they see is a nail, and they pound it with the hammer of Nazi Germany. It would be extremely helpful for people to visit some of that sense of American history. What I appreciate, though, at least, is, again, the silver lining of the dark cloud of what I think is just some category errors that people make about the Trump administration in particular, which I'm not a fan of. I know, Josh, you and I are both big Jonah Goldberg fans. I will steal his line here of Trump is not Hitler. Hitler could have repealed Obamacare. You have plenty of reasons to be concerned about all of this. And I at least do appreciate the immediate reaction against bad things that they view as bad things that they see the government doing, and being exercised about those. Even if I'm going to disagree with the exact context of them, you do still have a populace that sees things that I would regard as having authoritarian tendencies, if not being authoritarian in their characteristics, and reacting against it. So I think that is a healthy antibody response that the American public has, which is why, I don't want to think that, Americans are in some way have freedom passed along in their bloodstream. But for all of the other examples of self-governance that have failed, you can just point to that kind of weirdness, the true understanding of American exceptionalism that is kind of a built-in antibody response of, you're not going to tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about, to me, that suggests that if this were to collapse, it's probably not going to collapse in the way that people seem to want to straight line project it to collapse.
Yeah, I have to say too. So in my past life, I was a marketing professor and a consumer psychologist, and that "you're not going to tell me what to do" reflex. I don't think there's a country on the planet that has it to the extent that Americans do. I don't know if anybody studied whether it's heritable or not, but it's fascinating to me, and I agree that I think it means that actually things would not fall apart in really predictable ways. I think this sort of like, just, it's a reflex, right? And it's just like, whoa, buddy, like you're not going to tell me, right? I think we're losing it a little bit in partisan settings, right? Where it's like, you're not going to tell me what to do unless you're from my side. But I agree, overall, it makes Americans very intractable. And I think that's really good. I'm very hopeful as long as we have this like kernel of reactants in our DNA.
I'd be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity to plug. I believe it's a Seymour Martin Lipset example of the greatest unintentional social experiment ever conducted, because it had a control that you couldn't have planned for. So, of course, in the time of the American Revolution, if you were a royalist or loyalist, if you were on the side of England, you went to or remained in Canada. And of course, if you were an American patriot, you were in the colonies and became an American citizen after the Revolution. Fast forward exactly 200 years, right? Both Canada and the United States announced we're switching to the metric system. And the Canadians say, okay, eh? And Americans are like, the hell we are. And there is, again, I don't know if that's heritable, but there is just something about the American spirit, whether it is biological, whether it is psychographic, whether it is, I have no idea what creates it. But, when there are some people told that they're going to do something like that, which even, let's just be honest for a moment, the metric system makes so much more freaking sense than the imperial system, right? What would be the good reason for not switching, other than there's that part of being an American that I just love that's like, yeah, you're not going to tell me that we're going to do that. We're going to keep doing it the way that we're doing it. Even if it's not actually better, the part of Americanism that says, yeah, this is the way we do it and it's better because we do it that way, is something that I love. It can also go wrong, but it is, at its heart, is something that I love about this country.
The number of people I saw, even those who were no fan of Trump at the RNC last year when Hulk Hogan endorsed Trump and ripped his shirt open and commented how much they love the fact that people all over the world are watching this and don't understand what just happened. You have to be in the United States to get this culture. I'm with you, Eric. I love American culture for that reason. I absolutely do. The apostrophe America. I played a tune on the banjo, posted to YouTube on this channel the other day, and someone commented on it, America, USA, USA, USA. And literally underneath it, YouTube said, would you like to translate this to English? Because it is English. It's just America, I love our culture. I love the goofiness of it. I also recognize it can go awry. And I'm saying this not from the lens of Trump is Hitler, I fear a Trump dictatorship. But I do bemoan Trump presiding over the 250th anniversary celebration. I heard somebody yesterday even mention that the possibility that they're going to do a WrestleMania fight on the...
Well, he did it. UFC. I don't know.
Okay, UFC. Okay, well maybe it's better than WrestleMania, I suppose. But, sort of the lost opportunity, because I think of the... was it Calvin Coolidge that presided over gave one of the greatest speeches about the Declaration? I'm going to have to get my history might be off there a little bit, but about America being the final, termination of these principles are final. You don't improve upon the principle of equality or liberty. We might, we might improve upon
150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. I think it's not that I fear a dictatorship; it's that it just crushes my soul to think that the follow-up show is going to be a century later. Donald Trump, what the heck is he going to say versus what Calvin Coolidge said?
I mean,
I don't know if there's a question there, but
something Laura said, and I don't know if this speaks to anything you were just saying or not, but I think gives me more concern than almost anything, actually, is that Americans have this kind of naturally defiant spirit but it increasingly seems not to matter. They do what their party tells them.
Mm-hmm.
Many Americans, not all many Americans aren't affiliated with the party, but the ones who are sort of like they swear allegiance upon the altar of the elephant or the donkey, whatever it may be. And I've had many in the Republican Party. I think has went through a more radical, sudden transformation, which I think makes this more vivid. I mean, I have many Republican friends who now like hold positions that 10 or 15 years ago they thought the total opposite of. And their only explanation, if you really probe, I mean, they have no explanation if you really probe them quite often. Their party has just changed and they've stuck with the party over whatever it was they believed. That's really, that's the most kind of concerning phenomenon, I think, in our mass democracy in some ways, to me.
I agree with you up to a point. I mean, there are a large number of people who I think are going to follow the cues politically from political parties or some other kinds of leaders because they are not engaged in the kind of stuff that I think the four of us do on a regular basis, which is totally fine. Like, again, I want to stress the sense of envy I have about the people who on election day on election day between Harris and Trump are Googling who is running for president, right? Like there is, I will actually defend that in the idea that there's something beautiful in that there are people yet still who feel about this country. It's like, it's still fine enough for me that I just do not care that much about the two people who are running for president. There's something good and wonderful in that. And I don't think that we should overlook it. But to me, the more concerning thing, and Tao, you may have meant this in what you were saying, is the number of people who hold themselves out as being people of ideas, of kind of doing the kind of work that we do in our different areas, who really are at the end of the day, the one thing that they would not stop being is a partisan. And I've been truly surprised over the last 10 or 15 years at the number of people who I thought, a sense of consistency in philosophy or ideology or things like that meant a lot more to them than having whatever idea had an R after it or a D after it. And it just turns out that a lot of those people, not all of them, but a lot of them at the end of the day, cared more about the partisan affiliation of all of that. And I think that is bad. I also I make this point in conjunction, having done a lot of social media and digital marketing and doing community building online, when people get very, fit to be tied over the phenomenon of social media. I just like to remind people that we've been living with it for not even 20 years, which is just not even the blink of an eye in the whole history of this country, let alone the whole history of humanity. And there are just a lot of things that we have not adjusted to yet. And, I think it is fair to say that we're in a period of political transition, of, parties and coalitions changing, which those things have been pretty static for, almost 100 years. And yeah, it's a pretty big deal that is going on. But where I try to remove myself from being panicky about anything is that in the middle of it, it's very hard to understand the way that things are going to cash out. And I guess I try to take more of a wait and see approach with a lot of those things, while also trying to say what I believe to be true at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm.
So since we're right at the hour, but if you guys don't mind indulging me, we've had a very open-ended conversation, and we could easily go for another hour and probably still not exhaust what we would have on our hearts and minds. But if it's this open-ended, I would be remiss if I don't give everyone an opportunity for sort of final words. And I'm not necessarily going to prompt too much, because there may just be something burning on your hearts. It's such a big topic that you really want to say, other than just what is your hope for the future? What would you hope to impart to the listener that they would take courage in or take hope in the United States of America? And that hopefully 250 years from now we would be proud of.
Oh, so I grabbed a Wendell Berry quote that I'll read as my parting words, because he's far more eloquent than I could be. But this sums up my view, because I really look at a lot of the writing and talking and interviewing I do is talking about what if we looked at our civic lives as more oriented around relationships, and we thought about them in terms of relationships, because humans are designed and meant and evolved to be connected to other humans. We don't work as individuals. So I tend to look at things in very relational terms, and our civic lives are relational, and we need to understand them that way. But what Wendell Berry's talking about is basically like why you should stay married. So if I can make a plug for why you should stay married to America on this 249th anniversary, Wendell Berry writes, by staying and only by staying, we will learn something of the truth, that the truth is, let's see, hold on. Oh, you're going to have to edit this. Okay. By staying and only by staying, we will learn something of the truth, that the truth is good to know, and that it is always both different and larger than we thought. And I feel like that really encapsulates a lot of what we've talked about this on this podcast, because we've talked about humility and the idea that like these founding values are not defined for us. They're evolving, and our understanding of them is changing over time. So, we haven't gotten it right every time, but we keep trying to. And to me, that's the promise. And that's the work that I think that everybody is still saying they want to continue to engage in. And it's worth it.
First of all, I want to say I love the Wendell. I actually have a Wendell. I'm reading a Wendell Berry reading group, and I'm an 8th generation Kentuckian, so I have like this innate
Very good
on this. And I moved back to my hometown, so I have all these other fondnesses for him intellectually. But I think sort of building on some of what Laura said. I think American politics is meant to be a conversation between people. I think if I was to sort of tell my students something, tell future generations something, I think it's important to understand about our politics is that our politics is a conversation, and you're supposed to be part of that conversation. And that means more than just sort of logging on to Twitter or TikTok and raging against whatever you don't like. It means getting out in your community. It means doing things. I tell my students all the time, is like, if you don't like your representatives, get involved in your local party, and you can start to sort of undermine them over time. There are ways to even sort of change your congressman. I won't pretend like that solution necessarily leads immediately to changing their president, but there are ways to be involved in politics still. We could make things more local. We could be less factional, all these sorts of things. But it's a conversation. We all are still capable of being engaged in that conversation, and I think really meaningful and really beautiful ways.
Well, I'm going to bring us full Jaffa circle here with a Lincoln quote to close us out, because it is one of my favorite and I found least known of Lincoln's quote, which is from his electric cord speech. We have, besides these men, descended by blood from our ancestors, among us perhaps half our people who are not descendants at all of these men, speaking of the founders of the country. They are all men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian, men that have come from Europe themselves, or whose ancestors have come hither and settled here, finding themselves our equals in all things. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration, and so they are.
Beautiful. I appreciate the Saving Elephants. If anybody's playing bingo, we've checked off Wendell Berry and Strauss and Jaffa and Lincoln. We did well.
I do want to just know that I wanted to close with the equivalent of the the Wayne Gretzky Michael Scott quote thing of doing the Abraham Lincoln Eric Cohn. I'm just gonna that's the way I'm gonna choose to end this is the quote. So.
Awesome. Well, guys, this has been a great conversation, and it's been because of you three, Laura, Tyler, Eric. Thank you all for participating, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll have to do something just as good at the 250th anniversary your live stream. But again, thanks guys for hanging out with us.
We all get back together and have a UFC fight. That's what we're going to do, right?
I sign up for that. Absolutely. I'll be getting ready.
Everybody start training now. You got a year.
All right. I got it in the day planner here. I'll hold you guys to it. So with that, I will call tonight.
Thanks, Josh. Nice to meet
Thank
you
you.
guys.
So much. Nice to meet you.